Hey guys, so I've been recently fascinated by discussions that I've been following online about the standardization of construction supply. Some call it prefab, some call it modular, some call it offsite. But in general, the topic is very relevant. It is about how do we use standardization at a higher scale than we do today. Now, what I think many of the pundits out there that actually discuss that are missing is the first principle of standardization. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Hi there. So this week I want to talk to you about something that I'm sure many of you, as you're working in construction and the adjacent markets, have heard a lot, which is something akin to, hey, construction should be more standardized, or what if we had more standardized components, or what if we could pre-assemble more things and standardize them more. And I'm sure you have heard this many, many times, because in the minds of people who say this, they typically think that that's because construction would then become highly efficient. And my experience tells me that this whole argument is actually not addressing the first principle why construction is not standardized. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. So if I go back into my experience of the last 6 years working in construction, I realized that actually I have heard many different variations of prefab could revolutionize the building industry, or hey, with prefab and modular, we could have fewer material deliveries. The typical construction cost would reduce by X%, faster speed to market. And I'm sure many of you, whenever it comes to modular and prefab, offsite, standardized, pre-assembled, have heard the exact same thing. But actually, if you look at modular, you're seeing that it's still at a relatively small scale. In the US, it's sub 0.5% of the overall construction market. Globally, it's sub 0.8% of the global construction market. So again, this is where then the proponents will say, yeah, but if only. But the if only is unfortunately not solvable, in my opinion, on just a prayer level, or reducing it to arguments like I've just read on Reddit. Oh, the culture is not the same. We need to change the culture. It's not a culture problem. Let me explain. So when you look at the energy markets, there's a concept which is where I hail from. That's where I started my career. I studied energy economics. Then I worked a decade in the energy markets. And the energy economists, when you look at the supply of energy and the demand of economy, they have the demand of energy. They have a concept called the merit order. So what you call the merit order is basically you're plotting the megawatt hours of supply against the incremental cost of the next megawatt hour. And you get something that looks like this, the merit order. I've dumbed it down a little bit, and it's not technically accurate, but it's easier to show it this way for someone that is not familiar with energy. And essentially, you are stacking the cheapest source of the next megawatt hour at the bottom. That will form the sort of base load that you always want on as long as there is that supply, and it will always be in demand. And so you stack it further until you get to the most expensive source of the next megawatt hour, which is typically oil in oil power plants. Gas is a very popular source in the Western markets, especially in Europe. It's oftentimes used for the so-called peak load. That is, the very volatile peaks of the demand, which is when you use gas turbines in order to balance the grid, meet the demand, etc. But it's a relatively expensive source. But nuclear, for example, is at the bottom. And nuclear also means typically it's not not typically, actually always, it's not very good to ramp. It can't ramp very easily. You need a lot of time to switch it on, and then it just is there and it drives, and you don't want to ramp it as much, which is another reason, apart from the cost per megawatt hour, that it sits at the bottom. And so the bottom here that you see is always in demand. That's a concept of the merit order. And now if you match that actually with a very typical demand curve, it's called the duck curve because it resembles, to some people, not to me, but to some people, this is what looks like a duck. I don't know if that does to you, but this is a very typical day, intraday from midnight back to midnight, anywhere in the Western markets, what the demand curve will look like. Holidays are typically different, but this is a very typical day. And now you see the base load in this specific example would be in and around 112 megawatt, right? So here you can see this is where the base load will sit. Now, everything above that, to go back, will then have to be covered. This is not like for like, I'm just explaining the concept, will have to be covered with additional energy sources to be switched on. And it's this baseload demand and baseload supply that actually shapes what the supply side will look like. So if I standardize the baseload demand, that's what I can match my supply against. And I can build nuclear power plants, I can invest in hydropower plants, because I'm certain that the demand is there and that the demand is uniform, because a megawatt out of the power outlet in my home is always the same. So the demand is uniform, right? I can count on it and it is uniform. And that's demand shaping. And don't take it just from the energy markets, also take it from the automotive market. So what you see here is a very, very good illustration by the tier 1 OEM Magna out of Austria. And at the top, you see that the way you standardize a car is again driven by the demand for its components, not by the demand for the entire car and what it looks like. So an automotive manufacturer and the entire supply chain standardizes on the smallest demand unit. That could be a front or rear axle. That could be a wireless charging pad. That's how granular it goes, because this is a component that can be reused in every car, regardless of what it looks like. And then on that, they do the top hat standardization, which is basically the bodywork and the seats, right? So the point here is you standardize the supply on the smallest repeatable demand unit. And that is very important. So if you now continue that concept into construction, you have to think about demand shaping in exactly the same way. You don't shape the demand of this is typically, I'll come to the exception. Typically, you don't shape demand on this is the building that everybody has to live in. No, you standardize it on the smallest unit of demand, the same way that these automotive examples and the energy examples has shown you. And we have already done that in construction. We have it. It's called bricks. It's called cement. It is called 2x4s. It is called glass paints. It is called plastic parts. It is called sand. It is called rebar. We have standardized on the smallest demand unit. And that's what people who say that, oh, modular, prefab, or offsite would be so much better, they are not understanding this first principle. We have already done that. And why have we done that? We have done that because this can be used in every single project, regardless of what the top hat of the building will look like, one. And two, because the logistics and the supply chains for this become much simpler. Can you imagine what the assembly of a car would look like if the smallest unit of supply was not the underbody or the wireless charging pad, but the half of the car? The supply chain would become so much more expensive and the logistics would be so much more cumbersome. And the exact same thing happens in construction. If I have a pre-assembled wall and I leave it on the wrong floor, and then the wrong floor, unfortunately, is already encased, I cannot get that wall out anymore, but I can always get a brick out. I can always get a 2x4 out. So it does come with logistics and supply chain costs if I aggregate and standardize supply on a higher unit of demand. Now, you can see this exact same principle of demand shaping applied in the Soviet countries. It's called Plattenbau. So here you see former East Germany, where they use Plattenbau a lot. Why is this an example? Because the state shaped the demand. The state regulated that this ought to be built at scale for millions of East Germans between 1954 and 1990. Russia, this is a picture from Moscow. You know what this is? Plattenbauten. Because the Soviet countries said this is how we're shaping the demand. This is China, modern China actually. Why? Because the state says this is how we want to build. So that's the whole point. If you want to standardize construction supply and truly access the benefits of scale and repetition and the learning curve, you need to shape the demand. Don't go onto social media, complain how people don't get the benefits of modular. We do, but you need to shape the demand first, people, before you can actually then shape the supply on a higher level of demand. And construction is already standardized. It's called bricks, cement, and rebar, and 2x4s. Thanks for tuning in. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Make sure that you subscribe under aecvc.com, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. See you next time.